Good evening, it's Wednesday, November 27th. This is the Balie, I'm Arnon Grunberg. A warm welcome to the people in the audience and an even warmer welcome to the people who are watching this conversation from their mobile homes, their kitchens, their apartments or their bathrooms. This is going to be an evening about Kafka. At least that has been announced, but it's not just about Kafka. So those of you who came in here to expect just Kafka might be disappointed. It will be also about Else Lasker Schuler, Theodor Herzl, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, Gershom Scholem, among others. And it's not going to be an easy evening. It might not be an easy evening, so fasten your seatbelts, it can get bumpy. But Kafka has never been mentioned, has never been meant to be easy, so I think we will do justice to him by making it a bit difficult. Before I introduce my honored guest, Vivian Liska, a short summarization of what you can expect. I will talk with Vivian for about an hour, 1 hour, 10 minutes, and then there's space for you to ask any question you want, but what I always say, and I will also say tonight, a question is a question and not an anecdote or an opinion or a short story. All this can be done afterwards in the bar. Okay. We will start. I will introduce Vivian Liska. If I make a mistake, please let me know and correct me. Yeah. Vivian Liska grew up in Vienna, is a professor of German literature and director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp. She has published extensively on literary theory, German modernism, and German Jewish thought. Her works include Georgia Agamben's Empty Messianism, 2008, When Kafka Says We, we'll talk about it tonight, 2009, and one of her most recent books, German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife. Its Afterlife. Keep that in mind, 2017. In 2012, she was awarded the Cross of Honor for Sciences and the Arts from the Republic of Austria, and in 2013, she became a distinguished visiting professor at the Yale University of Jerusalem. Vivian, welcome.
Thank you.
Over dinner, you just told me that you have two mother tongues, two first languages, Hungarian and German. That's correct?
Hungarian was my literal mother tongue because it was my mother's language and the first language I heard. But I think that German is what one actually calls mother tongue.
Yes.
So the language in which I still count.
And the language also in which you still curse?
Oh, I can do that in any language.
I thought so, okay. And also you, at home you still speak French. That's correct. Let's start with Kafka and with your book, When Kafka Says We, because we'll talk about communities, among other things. The first sentence in your book is a quote from Kafka's diaries. I think it's an important quote for this evening, for your book, for what we want to talk about tonight. On January 8, 1914, Kafka wrote, "What have I in common with Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself and should stand very quietly in a corner, content that I can breathe." Let's start with the question, what does it mean when Kafka wrote that he has hardly anything in common with himself? And why are these sentences so important for you that you start your book about Kafka and about other authors, but Kafka is the center, he's also in the title, with this piece of his diary?
Thank you. This sentence by Kafka starts with the most banal of questions about one's identity. It could count for anyone who, what do I have in common with the Dutch or with Amsterdammers or with
the Belgians?
Belgians becomes complicated,
okay.
But yes.
Okay.
Yes, indeed. No, but it is the most straightforward, simple question about one's identity in terms of a belonging. The second part of that quote that you just read is already surprising. I have barely anything in common with myself. But then there is the third part, and should put myself quietly in a corner, content that I can breathe. So I think one has to look at all three parts. You asked about the middle one, that is indeed, on the one hand, the most surprising, on the other hand, points to Kafka as a modernist.
Exactly.
It is not accidental that we have the most elaborate version of not having in common with oneself, or rather of not falling together with oneself, with Sigmund Freud in the early decades of the 20th century. So there is something else in us. We are not made of one piece. We have an ich and an es and an it. Exactly. So we are not whole. We are not made of one piece. So if you can put this sentence of Kafka's, or this middle part, I have barely anything in common with myself, in that context. In the specific context, that the role that it plays here, it shows that it puts into question that very idea of being whole, being one. And that therefore, because we are complex beings that are made of very many different sides and aspects and dimensions, therefore, that very idea of belonging to one group, to one identity, is problematized. But then the really surprising thing, so how could I have in common with, if I don't even have in common with myself? Yeah. And then that last part, I should put myself quietly in the corner, content that I can breathe. Now, we see that this very simple question at first ends up in a completely different register. There is almost something like a metaphor to stand in the corner. It's like a children's punishment. You know, there's something I'm not doing right, obviously, because some people think that they can belong and that they fall together with themselves. And I should be happy that I simply exist, that all these questions, about belonging and identity, they are, if you go there, there's something dangerous happening. So, you better just breathe, which is the elementary way of being human, or of living, because It's not just humans. And beyond that, what this latter part of the sentence does, it turns it to literature. So a question that starts with, with something that could be used question. in any context, ends up in literature.
About the last part of that sentence, on the next page, you write quite explicitly that this I can breathe, standing, putting myself quietly in a corner, suggests Kafka's shame and guilt about his inability to be a part of a community, to have an identity at all. But it remains unclear if irony undermines this call for self-castigation evoked by the image of a child's punishment of being put in a corner. So there we have, I think, two important words, not only for Kafka, especially for Kafka, for many authors, maybe for this status of being in modernity, whatever we mean by that, shame and guilt, the inability to be part of a community.
So it is certainly the experience of artists and people who are in literature that there is a weakness, a kind of vulnerability of not standing with your 2 feet on a place, of not being settled, of not being established, and therefore also of not being, recognized as an entity, as an instance, as an authority. So the other of that, what he describes here, I don't belong to a group and barely to myself. What the feeling you get of that figure is something that is very fragile. And out of that fragility comes a shame. And I think in Kafka, although I very rarely go into Kafka's biography, but he is known to have had a father who was precisely that kind of an imposing figure, who was, in one of his stories, he talks about those who not only stand upright, but they walk on the street brushing other people's shoulders, like, not noticing who is walking on their sides or comes across. So it is vis-à-vis that figure that there is a kind of
shame and guilt. Well, of course, it's also can be found in his famous letter to his father.
Right.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you a question about the first part of your book. Consists of 3 authors who are very strange bedfellows. We have Franz Kafka, then we have a student club. Then, because of Dreyfus, what happened in France, he became convinced that there was no space for. And then there's Herzl Schuler, a German expressionist poet, writer of plays, a very bizarre figure. I'm not sure how widely read she still is in Germany. I assume a bit. So why, you try to explain it a bit in your book, but how come? I guess nobody else could do this. You need to be Vivian Liska to do this. How could you bring these 3 figures together, and why?
You're right that it's far from self-evident. One of the probably nastiest things that Kafka wrote that I read
about Herzl Schuler.
He wrote to somebody. Herzl Schuler was, in the eyes of many people, she was a kind of bag lady. She slept in cafes and apparently also on park benches. She was always very poor, although she came from a bourgeois home that was quite well off. But then she decided to join the La Bohème in the Café des Westens, and her friends made a collect for her, to collect money for her, and Kafka wrote, he gave 5, I don't remember, was Gulden or whatever it was, but he really doesn't see why he has to waste money on a kind of gypsy drunkard or whatever. I don't remember the exact Schimpfwörter that he used, but he definitely did not appreciate her.
No. And he could be quite nasty.
Yes, probably. But there was, I think that his literary imagination also ran away with him when he saw this lady. This lady, exactly. So she may have just become immediately a kind of literary figure, which she also presented herself as. So these 2 definitely don't
mix.
No. And the 3rd, even less. So Theodor Herzl, or at least what one knows of him, would not fit either one of the other 2. And yet, but I must say I was lucky that I was invited to a Herzl conference. That's how it started.
That's coincidence.
And it wasn't obvious for me because I didn't think that there was any literature of any importance that he had written. And I was very surprised. Herzl, toward the end of his life, he wrote philosophical stories. And at the very end, they are published in one book, but then there are a few that were written that did not fit anymore, and they were really his very last ones. And I thought they were fantastic because they put into question that which Herzl stood for and still stands for many people. There is this prophet, this visionary, and toward the end of his life, he put certain things into question that that intrigued me very much, and they had to do with precisely that figure. When one sees Herzl, even visually, you know, he's this figure, this prophetic monument.
Yeah.
And there, in those, so that I found these 4 stories. There is one where he talks about getting older. So he doesn't talk, it's 2 friends, and they talk about needing different glasses when you get older. And that he realizes that when one gets older, one becomes nearsighted, and one becomes, let's say, so that it is difficult to see from close by, and yet that needs glasses that allow you to read. And he got himself the kind of glasses that would allow him to see the world in its small details rather than in its big vision. Yeah. And there is another passage. It was not from the stories, but it was from his diary, where he writes that something that I think is extremely important for today, not only in the Middle East, but anywhere, where he writes that with getting older, he realizes that also a country, a state, in order to be built, needs heroes and visionaries. But that once that there is something established, it needs people who care about eating and sleeping and running about and caring about one's daily life. And that is a kind of Herzl that very few people know, and that probably was only expressed in his literature. Yes, so that's for Herzl. And one could see that monument of a figure was not made of one piece either. But what comes out in these stories are dilemmas and contradictions and self-doubt that point to the importance of everyday life rather than any kind of self-construction. Now, Else Lasker Schuler, in turn, was considered this phantasmagoric persona. And there too, one can see in her the texture of life that maybe only literature can bring about. But I'm speaking here in mea causa, in yours.
But what these 3 figures have in common, I hear you say, and maybe that's also why they are in your book together, is it belief that a kind of salvation can be found in literature? Even Herzl's?
Maybe particularly Herzl. Herzl needed to be saved from something about himself.
From his own
through
projects.
Literature, from his own grand demands and grand visions.
His own ego, maybe also.
I think in all 3 cases, literature functions very differently. But in a certain way, Lasker Schuler brings out the origin within literature of what can save, but the word is a very dangerous one because that in itself has very grand meaning, claims. I talk at some point in my book about saving confusions. Lasker Schuler believed that poets and that literature can confuse our preconceptions. And that where literature can save, it is not by giving us alternative answers to those that we find in our reality, but it is by, first of all, unsettling us in our certainties.
In our comfort zone.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I guess, speaking of those three authors, speaking of your book, speaking of your work, we should touch upon the difference between Ostjude and Westjude. We cannot avoid it. The differences between the Jews from Eastern Germany and the Jews from Western Germany, or the Jews who came from Eastern Germany and got westernized, became less Jewish. And also in your book you mentioned that Kafka, of course he was a figure filled with contradictions, wrote something about Ostjude, Eastern Jews, in a letter to Max Brod, a bit derogatory, a bit condescending, which was quite common, of course, among the assimilated Jews to look down upon those from Eastern Germany who still spoke Yiddish, who often were poor, and were considered also maybe a danger for those Jews who already got westernized, who already were westernized. Could you say a bit about why this is so important in your work, and what does it mean today? Is the difference, is the Jekke, the German Jew, does he still exist?
So, I think the best way to reflect on this is via Kafka and a particular text by Kafka. At one point, Kafka calls himself der Westjüdischste aller Juden, but one has to see what he means by that. Kafka it's very well known that the first and in some ways most important full affirmation of anything Jewish happened to him with the Yiddish theater. Yeah. So there was this Yiddish theater group that came to Prague and played these Yiddish, this Brettertheater, rather simplistic in the eyes of many, even primitive.
Sophisticated, yeah. For the sophisticated people, this was called like lower culture.
Exactly. And Kafka fell in love with that. And a large part of the first sections of his diary are about his enthusiasm of this theater. And he made friends there, and his father was outraged. He called it Ungeziefer.
Ungeziefer, Vermin.
Legt sich, yes, yes. And at one point, so we have already that contradiction that he calls himself Westjüdischste aller Juden, and then he fell in love with this Ostjüdisches Theater.
The most Western Jewish Jew who ever existed.
Yes, yeah. Yes. But one has to understand what he meant by that. And the best place to understand it is in reading his speech über die Jiddische Sprache.
That's your second chapter deals with it.
Yes. Now, there are different readings of that. For me, it gained an important place in
your book.
In my book, because my book is called When Kafka Says We. Now, one doesn't often associate Kafka with the first-person plural, with a we, because there is this book, one of the early books about Kafka by Marthe Robert, Seul comme Franz Kafka, alone, lonely like Franz Kafka. And that comes from a conversation that he supposedly had, that there are many questions if that really took place, but Gustav Janoch.
Another, yeah.
And there he said, he said he's lonely, and Gustav Janoch, how lonely? Lonely like Franz Kafka. But then even that sentence needs to be looked upon carefully. So, but still, it's very rare that one would associate Kafka with a we. Now, it is quite surprising how many of Kafka's stories are spoken, written from a perspective of a we. But in that speech of Yiddish, there is a very particular...
That was an introduction to the play that was performed in Yiddish.
It was an introduction to a poetry evening read by
Yitzhak Levy.
Yitzhak Levy, who became one of his friends from that. So he was an actor from that group, from that theater company. And Kafka, for once in his life, he took care of the tickets and of the publicity of that evening.
He could be very practical.
It seems so, but I think it was an exception. That he really, he was so enthusiastic, and then he gave this speech. And in the speech, there are two we's. And so the context of the speech is that there was this poetry evening read by Eastern Jewish actor.
Ostjude.
An Ostjude, exactly. But the audience who came to these theaters, they were Westjuden. They were already established. Prague. It was this was the public of his
Father.
Parents, exactly. Of his
Jewish bourgeoisie in Prague.
Jewish bourgeoisie who comes to that thing as a kind of folklore.
Like going to the circus, almost.
Yeah, but and maybe with a little
nostalgia?
Sense. That nostalgia that turns into something that just shouldn't come too close.
No. You want to see it, but it's like going to the peep show. You want to see it, but seeing no touching.
No touching.
No touching.
And it shouldn't touch you in both senses of the word. And that is exactly what Kafka sensed that they were. So that this audience was. In his diary, he writes, afterwards, he writes, I shot at them wie aus dem Flintenlauf. So he...
Yeah, this is beautiful, if I may quote
sure,
you again, because this is very ironic that somebody first who declared that he's the most Western European Jews of all Jews, later wrote that those Western Jews he addresses in his talk, he writes, to make them aware of the illusory nature of the quiet and harmony of their existence, to reveal to them the emptiness and triviality of their conformist Western European existence, and to convey to them his own restlessness and uncertainty. So this is like a big contradiction, I would say.
You know, there is a we at first. So he tells them, don't be afraid of Yiddish. He says, I know, I can see it on your face that you are scared of them. If they weren't, when they came in, by the time he said that, they certainly became uneasy. And then he says, you know, I don't know if he says Western Jews or
Western European. Wir. Yeah, of course it's in English here, but Western European existence. They're conformist, and then you quote Western European.
But there is the quote itself.
Well.
Where he, okay.
You'll find it.
Yes. Here. So, our Western European circumstances are, if we consider them with a cautious, fleeting glance, ordered in this way, and here he describes the Western Jew. Everything takes its quiet course. Here's die Ruhe. There, we are all established and quiet. We live in a virtual, joyful harmony, understand one another when it is necessary, get by without one another when it suits us, and understand one another even then. Wenn wir einander brauchen. No. Then we get along. So what he showed, and then who from within such an order of things, and here we talked about the Yekes and their orderliness, who from such, hier ist alles geordnet. When we need each other, we are, so there is no passion, and there's no joy, and there's nothing going wrong. This is an orderly thing. Who from within such an order of things could understand the confused jargon of Yiddish, or who would even wish to do so? So you have the word confused here, and before I talked about saving confusions in Lasker Schuler. So her whole play with reality and fantasy, but there is the idea that there is something saving from
the certainty, from
the order, precisely.
From the order.
And here we have that word you know, Yiddish is confused. It's confusing. It doesn't follow the correct order of grammar that would be expected. Many Yiddishists afterwards told me that he was romanticizing Yiddish terribly, and it's not true, and that there is a grammar, and that there is an order, and he knew nothing about it. But that doesn't really matter here.
It doesn't matter that it came out of ignorance.
No, because it had a certain function for him.
Yeah.
And then he draws them closer and closer. But and he describes a certain autonomy of the Western Jews. So they are alone, they are isolated, they are separate. They are not this crowd that is crawling over each other, as he describes in one
Eastern
of his,
Jews, yeah.
Yes. And he says we, in that it starts unsere europäischen Verhältnisse, our. And he says we. And then he brings them closer and closer to Yiddish. And at some point, at the end, he says, and I think that, well, I'm translating already. I think that this evening will unsettle you in quite a fundamental way. So, and then he becomes totally ironic at the end. And he says, and when you go, you should forget this evening very quickly.
You should forget your fear. Because the last sentence...
Your fear of... you will no longer be afraid of Yiddish, you will be afraid of yourself.
Yeah, and then the last sentence, because, that's very ironic, because we did not want to punish you.
Because we did not want to punish you. And that we, it's the actor who is going to read this Yiddish poetry and himself.
And of course, the whole speech can be understood as one big punishment of those westernized Jews.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's why he describes that he shot at them. But we have the two we's. We have unsere europäischen Verhältnisse, our... Yeah. So there he's a Westjude. And then at the end he's with the Ostjüdische.
He's going back to the Ost, yeah. He doesn't want to be defined. Speaking of borderland, before we go briefly to Herzl, there's one more quote from his diaries that I would like to discuss with you. I think also an important quote. Kafka wrote, "I have very seldom crossed this borderland between loneliness and community."
So you have to imagine, he's in that quote and in that whole passage there, he describes himself as living between loneliness and community. Now, where is that between? He has seldom crossed the border of that in-between, dieses Zwischenland. So seldom being completely in the loneliness and completely in the community. So where he could dwell was in that in-between. And for him, both the being all on your own, the autonomy, and the being completely caught in a community are dangerous. And you can see his figures running back and forth restlessly, so not ruhig like the Westjuden, in their Selbstgenügsamkeit, in their self-sufficiency, but also not in that closed community on the other hand. So it undoes, this quote undoes certainly the idea of Kafka as the total loner, and points to his awareness of the dangers of closed communities.
And of course, the total loneliness, being a loner is also a closed community.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Because both are totalizing figures.
You experience life. Yeah. You touched already upon Herzl's late shift in his life. And I'd like to discuss it briefly with you. In your chapter about him, about his legacy, you write that his late philosophical tales convey the change of focus occurring when youthful ideals of power, conquest, and success are replaced by the enjoyment of private life and the wisdom of maturity. after reading your chapter on Herzl, I got the feeling that this man who wanted to save the European Jews by bringing them to a homeland, not necessarily Palestine, but it turned out to be Palestine, at the end of his life almost regretted this semi-messianic endeavor.
I think it counts for, so taken together with what I said before about what he thought that a state that grows up should be, I think it counted for his own view of like doubting whether what he had done for himself, living so for the public life. So I think it was an individual reflection, but at the same time it was a reflection for values of the monumental and heroic on the one hand, and the everydayness, the quotidianness, the private that maybe counted more. Whether he regretted having brought the Jews, so having envisaged a homeland for the Jews. If one imagines that Herzl would have lived long enough to see what would happen to them without the homeland, I don't think he would have regretted that. Because I think that what came after a few decades after Herzl...
Undid the regrets. And what if he would have lived today?
Wow, that is some question.
I have to ask it. I mean...
Yes. You know, there are so many steps between his vision of then, and his vision was a European place in the middle of the Middle East. He would today have been destroyed from scratch as a, post-colonial
man, post-colonial white, heterosexual old man.
Exactly. So for him, there was something, it was not only saving the Jews, it was bringing the mission of enlightenment, of civilized world, of democracy, of all these absolutely positive values, to bring that to that place.
But he was also a bit naive, to say the least.
There was certainly a problem in the way he described it as, as an empty place. But then there were so many steps between that. I mean, the Holocaust lies between Herzl's vision and today, and many other things. And unfortunately,
also today's events.
Yes. Yeah.
The next author who takes a very important place in your book, in your work, I might say, is the poet Paul Celan, German, Romanian. About him has been said that he basically gave new life to the German language after it was destroyed by the Third Reich. Also a very complicated man. Over our beautiful dinner, we discussed his love triangle with Ingeborg Bachmann, one of the most important German poets after the World War II, and the Swiss author Max Frisch. And you mentioned, of course, that even in his love triangle, Paul Celan himself had on the side a wife. Very complicated.
On the side.
On the side. That's the best way of putting it. I'm not sure how else I could put it.
Be careful. Today, I don't know if...
Today it's more complicated, yes. The pledge to... You write about Celan, and then we are again in this territory between the loneliness and the community, the gray zone, the borderland. On one of his poems, which we will not discuss today, but you analyze it in front of a candle very well, I would say. You say, the pledge to commemorate this past implies for Celan the refusal of any continuity reaching across this fissure in time, and of common bonds based on religion, religious, cultural, and literary traditions in the name of an imaginary, impossible communion with the dead. So there with Celan, we move to a different space. The community is not longer with yourself, with your people, whatever that may mean. It's only with the people who are not there anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. You see, I think in that Paul Celan was much more of that loner than Kafka in the end. And Paul Celan ended up killing himself after increasing psychological problems that were or were not, this is difficult to say, caused by his war year experiences, mainly the death of his mother. It was for him, he was very, very attached to her, but they also say, and I'm not sure to what extent this was exactly like that, but Celan himself was, so Celan came from Czernowitz, and his parents were deported, and he had lifelong guilt that he could not save them. There was a friend of his could save his parents, and Celan, I don't know the exact circumstances. A key poem in his early poetry was written after his mother's death, after he heard of his mother's death. She was killed by the Organisation Tod with a shot in her head.
Yeah.
And there are two lines in that poem that say, in German it's Und duldest du Mutter wie einst ach daheim den süßen, den schmerzlichen deutschen Reim. And can you still bear, O mother, just as once at home, the sweet, the painful, the German rhyme? Now, ironically, the Heim and Reim, not only do they rhyme, but they correspond to the very German idea that it is the Dichter. Dichterisch wohnet der Mensch auf Erden. Yeah. So the poet is the one who gives man a home in the world. And Celan writes here, can you still bear that German ideal of a harmonious place of man in the world bestowed through
poetry. Also this belief in what's called in German Bildungsbürgertum, belief in Bildung, in education, in science, and especially, of course, in art.
And especially in poetry, and rhyme is the place par excellence of harmony. Because what is rhyme? Rhyme is when two sounds harmonize. And rhymes should not be exactly the same. So it is the non-same that is harmonized. So that is really the act of poetry that can do that. And that has become for Celan unbearable. So, and he addresses the mother with that. And his subsequent poetry will, that is very difficult poetry, difficult and dark in every sense, dark also to read, to understand, and becomes darker and darker
over the years.
Over the years. And, but it starts with that question, and can also be explained as a refusal to continue to. So he writes in German precisely because that is the place where he can undo that false harmony that no longer can exist.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You end your book about Kafka Says We with Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt and Kafka. Kafka comes back after a few travels to other places, among them post-war Austria and 3 post-war Jewish authors. Arendt wrote an important essay on anti-Semitism where she stated that the westernized Jew basically made a mistake to become a parvenu. And there was a way out. That's being a self-conscious pariah. And then she mentions, I believe, 4 people who were these self-conscious pariahs: Kafka, Chaplin, Heinrich Heine, and Lazare, if I'm... Yeah.
Yes.
And there's a beautiful sentence in your chapter called The Gap Between Hannah Arendt and Kafka, which, of course, is about this being a pariah and parvenu. For Arendt, Kafka, the 20th century man, offered an alternative, believing neither in the retreat into marginality nor in the consolations offered by nature and art like the disillusioned pariah, but also rejected the temptation of seeking exceptional access to society like the parvenu. He understood that the only possibility of survival for the one excluded from society was to use, quote, thinking as a new weapon.
This is very much Hannah Arendt and very West-Jüdisch.
You said to me, Hannah Arendt is like the Jekke again. This is the Jekke is like a condescending name for the German Jew. She was the most Jekke of all Jekkes.
Yes.
Yes.
With Jekke, you associate this, very disciplined, very orderly. So, the way Kafka describes it in his speech on Yiddish, there is in Arendt's. So you mentioned that I talk about the gap between Kafka and Arendt, and this is a reference to Arendt, the introduction to Arendt's book Between Past and Future, and that is called the gap between, it's in Arendt, it's called the gap between past and future. And there is a wonderful passage where Arendt shows herself in her full Jeckedom. Kafka writes in it, she quotes a little text by Kafka called Air, where he describes a man who is caught between 2 forces. One force that pushes him from the back forward, and another force that pushes from the backward, and he's caught between the 2. And Arendt writes, this is the past pushes him forward, so the past wants him to continue on and on the way it was. And the future pushes him back because the future presents obstacles to continuing and future ideas and so on. And then Kafka writes, and this man who is squeezed between these 2 forces dreams in einer Nacht dunkler als alle anderen Nächte. He dreams of jumping out of that fight and becoming a judge, looking from up there about a judge of both forces. And then Arendt the Jekke comes and says, no, you cannot jump out, you better stay in there. She says, Kafka dreams here this metaphysical dream of being nowhere and being above it all. She said, no, he has to stay there. And on that place where he's being squeezed, he has to create ein Parallelogramm der Kräfte. So a room, this is not a spot, this is a room. And in that spot, what happens there, dort muss stehen im Raum. And so the forces that come from the back, from the past, he can manipulate, so he can change them. He can intervene in history and thereby can change the future, depending on what happens in that. So he has to not jump out in a dream in the night, but arbeiten.
Arbeiten. But it's also along, of course, Hannah Arendt famously blamed, I think I can use the word blamed the Jewish people in Europe that they never sought any political power.
That's exactly,
and that's why that's come from this thought that she's saying to Kafka, no, you have to stay in the fight. Yeah, maybe that's very, very German Jewish. I'd like to go to your to a later book, and especially 3 chapters that you wrote about Kafka, German Jewish thought and its afterlife. Its afterlife is very ironic. In this book, there's also space for the law, very important in Kafka's world, language, and you rely on a few philosophers, among them Agamben, the Italian philosopher, and Benjamin and Agamben. And Benjamin, of course, Agamben is commenting on what Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, wrote about Kafka. There's the few sentences I'd like to discuss with you, a few thoughts in your first essay, As If Not, Agamben as reader of Kafka. There it is in the time that remains, Agamben's reading of the letters to the Romans, which was inspired by Jacob Taubes. We will not discuss Taubes today, but a provocateur. You call him a provocateur, a Jewish provocateur. Agamben calls Paul's hos me, this as if not, the most rigorous definition of messianic life. Can you explain, because the messianic life is important in I think, understanding Kafka. There's this famous quote, of course, by Kafka, famous aphorism that the Messiah will always come too late. One day after he's not needed anymore. What do you mean by, what does Agamben mean by as if not as the most rigorous definition of messianic life?
Okay, thank you. Maybe this is a whole
new
program.
Chapter. Yeah.
No, but I mean what you brought here is a whole program. I will try to link this together by starting with the subtitle of my book, that is written in smaller letters.
A 10 years legacy.
A 10 years legacy. It has been translated into German as prekäres Erbe. How would you translate that into Dutch?
Een precair erfstuk. Yeah.
So it's called German Jewish thought as something that is precare, fragile, vulnerable, and challenged by what I consider, so challenged by different ways in which it is being used, reflected upon, worked out and worked through today. And I mean today, let's say around 2000 till let's say in the early 21st century, and the last decade already of the previous one. And the case of Giorgio Agamben is one of those challenges. There are others in my book. Some come from Jewish sides, some come from
Christian sides.
Yeah, from a particular kind of Christian side. Yeah. And Giorgio Agamben, what you quoted now, is a very specific case of that challenge. So Giorgio Agamben is an Italian philosopher, still alive, must be pretty old. So there too, I was invited to a conference with and on Giorgio Agamben, and Kafka somehow was in my whole
your package, your suitcase.
Yes, yes. He was the one who would save me. You talked about saving. Yes, saved me when I was a bit lost, you know, as to how to read. So it helped me. It gave me a lens through which I could read, and I saw that Giorgio Agamben had written a lot about Kafka and about other authors that I've been dealing with. Also Paul Celan, by the way, and a lot about Kafka, very importantly so. The position I realized that Giorgio Agamben has, from which he from where, so the place from where he reads these authors, particularly Kafka and Benjamin, came out of what I don't speak in such shorthand in my book, but what I call a very surprising Christian anarchism that comes from Paul. So there was a certain wave. I don't think it is so prominent anymore now, but even like till 10 years ago, there was a wave of several philosophers who considered Paulus, so the Apostle Paul, as a model for today. Why? Because Paulus is the one who rescinded, who sublated, aufheben, the law as the Jewish law, the Torah, and he said Christ has fulfilled the law, so Jewish law.
So because of Christ, we don't need the law anymore.
We don't need the law, and we only have love. And the law is no longer necessary.
So love replaces the law.
Sure, that
okay.
is, yes.
That's the essence of this Christian anarchism.
Yes, because, and for Agamben, Paulus then becomes, so this act of undoing the law also has political
implications. Of course.
So the world order is terrible, it is oppressive because the law is oppressive, democracies are an illusion. In reality, Agamben was close to that whole movement of the Brigate Rosse.
I know.
So that's where that comes from.
My question is, why does, if Paul is so important, and I understand why does Agamben need Kafka between Paul and him?
Okay, so Kafka has dealt massively with the law. He was a lawyer. He studied the law, and he then worked in an insurance company. And his most famous text is called "Before the Law." So Kafka dealt with the law, was critical of the law, but for Agamben, Kafka is a figure who undoes the law, just as Walter Benjamin undoes the law. And I can give you the most miniature example of Agamben's reading of a Kafka text.
Before the law.
Before the law, because it is quite striking.
It's a very interesting text. You wrote a whole chapter about it.
Yes, a whole chapter about a page and a half by Kafka, but it is a page and a half that has been the most interpreted text among philosophers in the 20th century.
Before we go to the text, I would like to go
to
1 second back to Agamben, because the language,
okay.
Because let's forget, okay, we have Paul, we have the Hosmi, the language, and then we maybe go back to Messianism and the Messiah. Because here another quote, Agamben draws a close parallel between the structure of the law and the structure of language. Like the law, language subjects men to an inescapable preset code, and like the law, language exercises a ban. It always proves inadequate and prejudiced in its claim to capture reality, yet one cannot step outside language in order to fathom what cannot be said in it. Agamben thus contends, our age does, indeed, stand in front of language just as the man from the country in the parable stands, in Kafka's story, stands in front of the door of the law. In a state of ban, which only the division of the division, the abolition of the differences that elicit meaning, the revocation of the signifying structure of language can resolve. So basically what Agamben is saying, that we should go beyond the written word, and he's using Kafka for this, going beyond the law in order to free ourselves from this inadequacy and prejudices.
I can't believe I wrote this.
Yes, and not too long ago.
What do you mean
you couldn't believe it? It's so good.
I find it shockingly convoluted. Really. Especially when I have to simplify that in oral language to explain in a few sentences. But you did it, actually.
Okay.
Yes, I think you explained perfectly why we are in front of language as in front of the law. So the law is the word ban. We are confined, constricted by the law. because we don't have full freedom to do what we want. That is really simplifying. But in any case, there is this sense that the law is oppressive.
Yeah. Walter Benjamin is saying also that the law and lawlessness are basically the same in his essay on Kafka.
Yes, but first the link to language. How come that language is oppressive? Because we, in our everyday life, we use language as a means of communication. But when you look closely, you can also see language as a kind of grid that doesn't really give us reality, because words fall short of what it really is. And therefore, there is a certain confinement where language, when I say, I want to describe the reality of this, and I say, this is a bottle, and it is a see-through bottle, and no matter how detailed I will go, it will never actually reach the reality of this glass. I'm sure that you as a writer make this experience all the time, but you as a writer, and that's where Agamben goes, you have the possibility to shake that grid a bit and to work with language in ways that do open up alternative perspectives.
Absolutely.
So I think
absolutely. I can, what can I say? I can only say yes, of course.
Yeah.
I think we should mention before the law is important in this second book of you. And also it's important that the man standing in front of the law, before the law, is a man from the countryside. And there you use 3 words from Hebrew. He is Am Haaretz, literally a man from the countryside. And what does Am Haaretz mean? It's somebody who doesn't know the law. So somebody standing for the law who doesn't know what he's standing for. That's often misunderstood because not so many people know what Am Haaretz is. And then you write this beautiful, again, a very nice quote from Kafka. Why we need the Am Haaretz, why we need the not knowing person. Okay, I'll write it here. And you quote him in German and then there's an English translation. It's very funny also, I think. Kafka writes in his diaries, aus dem Talmud geht ein Gelehrter auf Brautschau. So soll sich einen Am Haaretz mitnehmen, da zu sehr in seine Gelehrsamkeit versenkt, das Notwendige nicht merken würde. When a scholar sets out to look for a bride, he should take with him an Am Haaretz, the Yiddish expression for Am Haaretz, because too engulfed in his studiousness, he would not see what is necessary.
Thank you.
That's so, yeah.
It sounds like a joke, but it is a passage in the Talmud that says that, really.
But the Talmud can be very funny sometimes.
Especially when Kafka quotes it. Because for me, as a scholar, I only mentioned this at the end of my text to prove that Kafka knew the expression Am Haaretz, man from the country, which is from Hebrew, but Kafka uses in the Deutsch-Yiddish formulation an Am Haaretz.
Am Haaretz, yeah.
So there is, on the one hand, it is only a scholarly proof that he actually knew that. But on the other hand, it also conveys something that runs through both of my books and that I already mentioned a few times, and that has to do with the valuing of the everyday. Because the Am Haaretz is precisely not the spiritualized scholar. He is in the way you could say, the simple man from the country. But the necessary, whatever is necessary, and of course on the date with when you're looking for a bride, there are certain things that are necessary that the purely spiritualized man wouldn't see, and therefore takes the Am Haaretz with the Am Haaretz. But it even has a content connection to the chapter about before the law. And we started with Agamben, so I can maybe link the two.
Yes, please.
So Kafka's famous story, there is a man who comes from the country who comes to the door of the law. There is a doorkeeper who says, I cannot let you in, for sure not now, maybe later. The man spends his whole life in front of that door, and at the end, the doorkeeper shuts the door. Very important, just before he shuts the door. First, he sees a little glimmer of light coming through the door from the law, and he asks, how come nobody else has passed by this door on all these years? Yes. And he says, because it was meant only for you, and he shuts the door. And now I'm closing the door. So that's the Kafka story. Giorgio Agamben has read this text in a way that I'm very critical of. So he invokes Paulus. How? He says that this text has always been read as a failure. The man of the country is a failure. He didn't get through the law. He came to go into the law, and he sits there all his life, doesn't get in. And as my students have pointed out when I read that, so some have indeed said, why doesn't he just go in? Like, who cares what the doorkeeper says? But then there were other students who said, why is he sitting there? Why doesn't he turn around and leave? He should get a life. I remember I was in front of some American students. He should get a life. No, he sits there at that door. What Agamben has done is yet another interpretation. He says, one thinks this was a failure. No, one hasn't read that right, because he has succeeded to finally get that door to the law to be shut. And this is, therefore, he is a kind of Paulinian Christ figure who also shut the door to the law. And I found that, on the one hand, a totally ingenious new interpretation. And after, I don't know how many hundred interpretations, it was already quite something that he came up with a new one. But also a completely...
Even though you dislike this interpretation.
Oh, completely wrong one. Completely wrong. For many reasons. But maybe I just... First of all, Kafka spent the page and a half of that text describing in detail the man's negotiation with the doorkeeper. He tries to bribe him, he answers questions. So there is something essential going on in that text that is being negated if the text is all about shutting the door. Now, my dislike of the story obviously has something to do with the fact that I don't believe that it is all that great, even in politics, to shut the door to the law completely, but also because I don't think that the Paulinian approach to Judaism is fully justified, but I wouldn't even go there. There's a much more literary reason why he's wrong, Agamben. There's a crucial element in the story that he has completely left out, and that I did mention just before. Agamben does not mention the light that comes. It's a little light, it's only a faint light that shines through the door that the man sees before he dies. If it was such a great thing to get that door to be shut, why did Kafka write about that little light that still shines? So it is much more a story about modern man who doesn't have access to this anymore. And there is still this very faint light that shines. Not
access to the tradition, but there's still the light.
It is very faint. Ein Glanz.
A glance.
Yes.
Speaking of this light, speaking of ordinariness, before we go to your favorite, one of your favorite texts by Kafka about a mouse, I'd like to touch briefly on Abraham, because it's also in your book, German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, a very interesting chapter on Hiob and Abraham. And there's this ordinariness again. Kafka writes about a famous book by the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling, which is about Abraham's sacrifice. The story of Abraham in the Bible, Abraham going to the mountain to sacrifice his own son Isaac. And then Kafka comes up, he doesn't go into the direction of Kierkegaard, who basically believes that you have to jump, you have to trust God and go there knowing that it will be all right. Kierkegaard asks something that might be too big. Kafka comes up with a different Abraham. An Abraham who's very practical. He says, okay, I have to follow this command, but I'm not sure if I can do it. And then also he says, basically, to God, I cannot get away from home. I'm indispensable. The household needs me. I found this so funny, but also so, speaking about daily life, this is a beautiful defense.
Absolutely. Yes.
The household needs me. I cannot kill my own son because the household needs me. I mean, this is... Yeah.
It's a wonderful passage. Kafka writes that in a letter to his doctor, who was also a friend. He says, in one of my sleepless nights, I imagine another Abraham. And that was, he had read Kierkegaard, and for Kierkegaard, Abraham, he calls him a knight of faith.
A knight of faith, exactly.
Yeah, a knight of faith, because his faith in God was so, it was even more than ethics, so that he would even kill his son. And for Kierkegaard,
he would transgress any morality in order to show his faith.
Yes.
Basically, that's what faith is for Kierkegaard.
Exactly. And Kafka writes to Robert Klopstock, he writes, in my sleepless night, I imagine another Abraham. This Abraham would love to be a good servant to God. Wie ein Oberkellner, like a waiter, he would, he would be ready to bring him what he wants. So in this case, his son, the sacrifice of his son. But, as you just said, I can't get away, I'm sorry, I'm busy here, mein Haus ist nicht fertig. And there remains always one more thing to be done. I wouldn't even have a place in my house where I can put the knife with which I could then go to kill my son. So I'm very sorry. And then the next sentence, noch lange nachgedacht. I still thought a long time about that. Am nächsten Tag. He still thought a lot about that. Because he thinks that diese anderen Abrahame, and now they become in the plural.
The more Abrahams.
Because it just becomes a mode of life. Diese anderen Abrahame, they deliberately built houses that are not or cannot be finished.
In order to...
So on purpose, in their houses were always one more things to be done, so as not to, and it's a beautiful image, so as not to have to lift their eyes and see the mountain in the distance.
That's a beautiful.
And it's beautiful because so it talks to us about concentrating on the world here, on our house, on our world building, but he doesn't negate that mountain is there.
But he doesn't want to see it.
But he doesn't want. No, he's let's say he's
keeping himself busy in the kitchen in order not to see.
Yeah, but he knows somewhere.
Maybe not to see the Messiah. It's an end-time.
That quote, it's one of my favorite quotes. The one you had, the Messiah will not come the Messiah will come when he's no longer needed. He will not come on the last day, but on the very last day.
Yes.
Now, I was thinking about that for a long time. I didn't understand, what does it mean, the last day, not the very last? And then I think I figured it out. Because when he comes on the very last day, then the very last day becomes the last day. But then the Messiah doesn't come on the last day, but on the very last. And that very last is becoming the last on which it doesn't come, and so on. Ad infinitum.
And it's postponement. It's
exactly.
Postponing.
Exactly.
And that's also very Jewish, I would say.
I mean, it is it has become very Jewish because that is the view of a Messiah that hasn't yet come. And it is in that postponement, but you know what? It is also very much literature, because it is only in literature that you can make the distinction between the last and the very last.
You can also say maybe literature is very Jewish.
If that is what literature is.
But at last we know that messianic thought and messiahs are always very dangerous.
Yes.
Always. You wanted to talk, before we give the audience a chance to ask questions, about one of your favorite texts by Kafka.
Yes.
It's about a mouse. We go from Abraham's kitchen and the household to a mouse. I think that's fitting.
I will just tell it by heart, because...
Your computer doesn't work?
No. No, I think I overextended it literally.
You killed your computer.
Yeah, but
okay.
I think I can do this. I can do this by heart.
Okay.
So, it is the story. It starts with, Ach, sagte die Maus. In English, alas, said the mouse, but alas doesn't sound like ach. No. It's much too refined to say alas. Ach, sagte die Maus. Die Welt wird enger mit jedem Tag. The world becomes narrower every day. At the beginning, it was so wide that I was scared and started running. And there was a moment when I saw from far 2 walls on the right and on the left, but and was happy, glücklich. A rare word in Kafka. Ich war glücklich. But these walls are getting narrower and narrower to each other. And at the end is the trap into which I run. Du musst dich nur umdrehen, sagte die Katze. You only have to turn around, said the cat, and ate it up. Und in German, it's even shorter, und fraß sie. So I claim that this little text tells the history of civilization. And not only the whole history of civilization, but talks about our time in big ways. The mouse, why did the mouse start running? Die Welt war so weit, dass ich Angst hatte. And there is, I think it's Groucho Marx.
Good that you mention him. What's an evening without Groucho? Yes.
It's the 2,000-year-old man. Is that?
It's not Groucho. That's not Groucho. Who is Karl Weiner? Karl Weiner. I don't know the 2,000-year-old man.
The 2,000-year-old man was asked what was his means of transportation 2,000 years ago? And he answers, fear. Our whole civilization, that is one argument, has developed out of the fear of a wide, empty world where there's nothing. And then civilization grew, one started building. So the mouse started running because the world was so wide, and started running, and glücklich von der Ferne saw 2 walls on the left and on the right, links und rechts. And there is a first orientation. So one can orient oneself. That's why it says rechts und links. But, and this is all one sentence. When I read it, then you can hear, I get out of breath. Links und rechts, aber die eilen so schnell aufeinander zu, dass dort schon die Falle ist. And that trap, so that whole idea of our civilization that is becoming too, constraining and confining, and we are running in the trap of anything from climate change to artificial intelligence and whatever feels like a trap that we are straight running into. So that would be a kind of critique of modernity and of progress and of the idea.
And basically, also you're implying in this interpretation of the short story, of the fable, that civilization itself might be a trap.
Absolutely, and that where we are running towards
it, without knowing it.
Yes, but then, what does the cat have to do with that? And the cat says, she has the solution.
Just turn
Musst dich
around.
nur umdrehen. Just turn around.
She's a very seductive cat.
And it is the seduction of all the ideologues who want to create a new humanity and who have the solution, a religious one.
And who always like to look at the past, to glorify the past. That's one of the characteristics.
It used to, now you are in a trap.
But it used to be good.
It used to be much better. Now you are in a trap,
again.
but I have the solution and I can save you. And that can be fascism and communism and
whatever you want to call it.
Whatever you want to call it. And the cat thereby presents the solutions, and the seductive solutions, und fraß sie, and ate it up. Now, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a wonderful story. Thank you.
And the consolation of literature, yes.
Exactly.
I guess this is the best point to open the discussion to the public. Jante is walking around with a mic. Maybe you can mention your name, raise your finger, your hand if you have a question, and I'm sure Vivian will do her utmost to give a good answer.
Yes, indeed. Consolation.
Consolation, yes.
No anecdotes. My name is Hans de Kok van Delwijn. I wouldn't know why I had to mention my name, but never mind. Thank you for this very nice and entertaining interview. It was 100 years ago that Franz Kafka passed. What would you say is his relevance, his urgency for our youngest generations? What does he leave us? What does he brings us? And what does he brings to mind? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. It is how I start my course when I teach Kafka. I think that, Kafka said of himself, I am the end or the beginning. It is a reversal, and more than a reversal, of one of the famous sentences of the Western world. Ich bin das Alpha und das Omega. Kafka says, I am the end or the beginning. So it's reversed both because he starts with the end and ends with the beginning, but it's also because there is an or, and the or is both the sign of uncertainty but also of possibility. So I think that one has in Kafka a sense of a very critical view of the world as it is. And I mean, if you look at his novels, there is certainly a despair and a being exposed to forces that you don't have access to, a loss of control, a disempowerment. That is all there. There is that, probably the word that comes up most often in Kafka is aber. And yet. So there is something in that and yet that I think one can and should convey to the young people. But I think there is also something that I felt for a while got lost in the time one called postmodernity, but postmodernity is behind us.
Non-existent anymore.
Yeah.
It passed away.
Yeah. It really is. But for Kafka, the big meanings of life and the big answers have become inaccessible. True. So what one would call Nietzsche's, death of God. But in Kafka, when you look at the novels, The Trial or The Castle, these things are huge. They have dimensions, so the court is terrible, but it is everywhere. You cannot reach it. You don't know. Also, as a reader, is this metaphysical? Is this political? But what you sense is that there is the immensity of its dimension. And in the castle, you only see it in the fog, but you know that there is something really big there. So when I talk about the sense that, even Nietzsche talks about, do we realize what we moderns have done
to ourselves?
And not only to God, to truth, to the idea of a unified cosmos, to all these things that have disappeared. And he says we have to live up to the dimensions of having done away with that.
Of the dimension of the loss.
Of the loss, exactly. Of what one would call a Leerstelle. And there is
an empty space.
The empty space is huge. And what I felt when I say what got lost in postmodernity is the sense of this immensity. So I think you see, I go from the mouse to the
mountain to the empty space. Yeah.
Yes. So I think that too is something that one can convey, and maybe not the most obvious that comes out of reading Kafka.
Thank you, Vivian. More questions?
Yeah, I actually have two. So I was wondering if you couldn't tie the aloneness to the community to the separation between Ostjude and Westjude. Westjude maybe being a bit isolated in an alien society, and Ostjude being amongst each other.
Yes.
And my second question would be, don't you feel that you're kind of betraying Kafka by trying to explain him in a logical sense, like connecting that to the story of the mouse and the man before the law, because maybe Kafka has lost his trust in reason?
Thank you. I'm tempted to start with the second question, but no. We're orderly. We are
Jekke. Wir
europäische,
Westeuropäische.
So, your first question, absolutely. There is the isolated human that Kafka does associate with the Westerner, and the community that are the Easterners, and that so the Ostjuden. That relates to the idea that came from the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, where the idea of the autonomy, the Selbstständigkeit of the subject, of the individual, became important. What happens by the time we get to, so when thinking about, the Kantian Enlightenment, when we come to the time of Kafka in the early 20th century, there is an awareness of that, so that autonomy has become isolation. So it's driven to an excess, to the point where it turns into something negative, so what one calls the dialectic der Aufklärung. The same with reason. Reason as a value of the Enlightenment, and when you drive it to the excess, what happens in Kafka's figures is a kind of rationality that becomes so excessive that it becomes
irrational,
almost a kind of madness.
Yeah.
Yes.
The same happens, of course, with the law. The law becomes lawlessness.
When it is excessive.
Exaggeration.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes, so you're absolutely right that the community but it was a topic at the time with Ferdinand Tönnies, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, was a topic that precisely because the Gemeinschaft and the communities started dissolving. And they dissolved when the young people moved to the cities and they become urbanized, and there they felt lost and had lost their roots. But Kafka precisely describes himself in the in-between, because he saw the dangers of both. He saw the danger of the isolation, and he saw the danger of these closed communities.
That's what you mentioned before.
Yes, yeah. Yes, precisely. And now, can you remind me of the second question briefly?
That's yeah.
So I feel that one of your critiques of the reading by Agambe was that he explained the story in a wrong way.
Okay.
And
yes.
In that way, you.
If I don't betray Kafka,
that's the question.
In that way, you implied to me that you know the right reading.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So Kafka is the perfect place to find oneself as a reader reflected. You know, the man before the law stands before the law like I stand before Kafka's text. And you can find that kind of reflection everywhere. I think that I am part of a conversation. So in a conversation, a conversation with other readers of Kafka. And you find that in Kafka, you have people, even right after the text before the law, the man starts discussing this with the priest who has told him the story. And they are discussing, and each one thinks he's right. So I consider myself in that conversation, and I feel that I have the great privilege of being in a
part of the conversation.
In that conversation where everybody thinks that he
is right.
He's right.
Maybe we should mention now the Mishnah, which is basically like an explanation of the Torah, of the law, of the Bible. And there, of course, one scholar disagrees with the other. And the whole conversation about the Mishnah, about lernen, is to know that there can be disagreements about the text. And basically studying is disagreeing about what's the right interpretation. So in a way, also you mentioned that you speak not about readers of Kafka, but students of Kafka. And if I may call us students of Kafka, we can disagree about your interpretation, my interpretation, Agambe's interpretation, and this is what studying Kafka is. So there's not one right interpretation.
But at the same time,
as
you
text.
say,
you always go back to the text.
I have to say, this is my...
Yeah, of course. You have to keep on fighting. You have to say, but Agambe didn't see the light.
Right.
Agambe is stupid. The stupid Italian philosopher, he didn't see the light coming out of the door. Okay, next question.
Hello, you hear me? I'm Arnold Oldenburger. My name is Arnold Oldenburger. My question is, you said that Kafka was the most Western Jewish person there was, and then you speak about Eastern Jewish people. But for me, as a Hollander, Dutch people, and I consider Prague already Eastern Europe. So I would say Kafka is somebody from the East. So I was wondering, who are those Eastern Jewish people then? Are those people from Russia or anything, like the acrobats? Or is it more like the Jewish proletariat? So is it a matter of social class,
also,
whereby
yes.
the lower class is speaking Yiddish, and the Western Jews don't do that anymore.
You're absolutely right that there is in Kafka's speech on Yiddish that he senses that these people, these more established more Western Jews, like everybody who comes from a village, who comes from a lower class, doesn't quite like to be reminded of these origins. Or there is something a bit uncanny of being reminded. So
of the
there is
Ostjude, of the origin.
Of these origins.
Of the shtetl, exactly.
It's an very ambivalent, and Kafka does touch.
But it has to do with class. There's a beautiful example, which I find a very good example of what the difference is between Ostjude and Westjude, is Arthur Schnitzler, the Austrian playwright, novelist. He's definitely a Westjude, I would say. He became a Westjude, but his grandfather was a poor man, a poor Jew from, at that time it was of course Austrian-Hungary, it was an empire from Hungary, who couldn't read, who couldn't write, and he was an alcoholic. And then the son became a famous doctor in Vienna, and the grandson became this famous playwright and novelist. So there you see how an Ostjude in 2 generations can become a completely convincing Westjude.
I very much like the way you started, that you said for you, as a Hollander, Prague is already Ost. And it reminded me, if I may tell a very small anecdote of my teaching experience that was an eye-opener for me. I was teaching literature, Jane Austen. I had a Chinese young woman in my class, and she said she would talk about the Chinese Jane Austen, and her English wasn't very good, and we didn't quite understand what she was talking about, and we all couldn't read that novel. So we said, I said, let's use this opportunity to ask her questions about China. And there was a student who asked her, "Do husbands help in China?" And then she said, I come from a little village in the north of China, and there's a river running through that village. And north of that river, the husbands help, and south of the river, they don't.
That's beautiful. I like it. There's time for one last question, if there's still... Yeah.
Oh, hi, my name is Tamar, so you can hear where I'm coming from. And you were talking about Herzl in the beginning and trying to save Herzl. And I thought, do you know who can save us from Herzl or from his heritage?
I think the late Herzl, who thought that leaders of nations should care about people sleeping well and eating well, I think that late Herzl could maybe save us from...
That's also what you write in your book about him.
Yes.
And then we are back with the ordinariness, the kitchen, the mouse. Dear audience, I thank you for coming, for listening to us. And if you're in your kitchen or in your bathroom, look at the mouse, look at the walls, in order not to see the mountain, but don't forget that the mountain is there. Have a good night, and we will meet again. Thank you. Thank you, Vivian.